Hi, everyone. I'm so excited today to welcome virtually to the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, Dr. Meha Hilal, uh, as part of our series of sort of book talk events here at the center. Dr. Hilal is a researcher and writer on institutionalized Islamophobia, and she's the author of the book that we will be discussing today. It's called Innocent Until Proven Muslim: Islamophobia, the War on Terror, and the Muslim Experience Since 9/11. Meha Hilal's writings have also appeared in Vox, Al Jazeera, Middle East Eye, Newsweek, Business Insider, Truth Out, among other outlets. She's the co-founder of Justice for Muslims Collective and was previously the inaugural Michael Ratner Middle East Fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., where she produced research and writing on the consequences of the War on Terror on the Muslim community. Dr. Hilal is also an organizer with Witness Against Torture and a council member of School of the Americas Watch. She earned her doctorate in May 2014 from the Department of Justice, Law, and Society at the American University in Washington, D.C., and also received a master's degree in counseling and a bachelor's degree in sociology from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Meha, we are really excited to hear about this work, and everyone, please join me in welcoming Dr. Meha Hilal.
Well, thank you so much, Daryl, for the introduction, and thank you both to you and Tom for putting together this event. It's such an honor to be here with you and also the Center for Middle Eastern Studies. So the book that I've just published, as Dr. Lee mentioned, is called Innocent Until Proven Muslim: Islamophobia, the War on Terror, and the Muslim Experience Since 9/11. This book is a culmination of the research, writing, organizing, and advocacy that I've done for more than a decade now. I would say my entry point into understanding the War on Terror and the ways in which it impacted Muslims was an internship I did in 2007 at Amnesty International, where I was focused on Guantanamo Bay Prison and an end to torture. For those astute observers, that was kind of a joke, Guantanamo Bay obviously has existed in the course of the War on Terror. Guantanamo Bay Prison has been a site of the detention of Muslim men post 9/11. And to me, that was the first sort of entry point into understanding the extent to which the United States government would go to criminalize the Muslim community under the guise of the War on Terror. So usually when I start these presentations, I refer back to a quote from President Bush in a speech he gave on September 20th of 2001 to a joint session of Congress 9 days after the 9/11 attacks, in which he stated, quote, "Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated." So the reason I start often with this quote is, for one, this is the first time that Bush used the phrase war on terror. For two, what Bush was obviously intending to say, although perhaps it wasn't quite obvious yet, is that this war on terror would be vast, nebulous, and without any particular end in sight. Moreover, what Bush was outlining was the fact that there were no tactics that the United States could not use in order to fight this, quote, terrorist threat and the war on terror. When we look back on the war on terror, now that it's 20 plus years old, it's important to look back at this quote and think about how it all started. While people often think and say that they're unsure as to how we got to where we are today, to me, it is very clear how we got to where we are today based on what Bush outlined from the very beginning. In the course of doing the research on this for my book, one of the articles I came about was from Ben Rhodes, who was a former Deputy National Security Advisor to President Obama. And his article was called "The 9/11 Era is Over." Now, of course, that title represents a particular viewpoint, right? That we no longer have to worry about or are not under the same threat, at least the constructed threat, that we once faced as the United States. However, it really depends on what your vantage point is. Is the 9/11 era over for those who have been targeted, including Muslims, of course, who have been disproportionately targeted by the war on terror? In his op-ed, he also mentions that there's a sign in the CIA building that says every day is September 12th. We know that the war on terror has involved fear, and the use of fear has been utilized, of course, to justify and legitimize the use of brutal tactics and state violence. And when that is the sort of operating principle that every day is September 12th, it's clear why the war was fought the way it was and why it continues to be fought the way it is. So there are a couple political goals I sought to accomplish in my book. One is remembering. I'm sure many of you in the audience have paid attention to or listened to on occasion speeches that have been given every year on 9/11, commemorating the attacks and mourning those who died on that day in 2001. Of course, this is important. However, what's never mentioned are the lives of those who have been destroyed post 9/11 in the war on terror. So this is about remembering and who gets remembered. It's also about denormalizing. What does it mean to think of a world where the war on terror is not omnipresent? We often think of wars ending in the sense that there are no military troops on the ground. There are no troops on the ground. But in my book, I specifically outline and write about how that's not the only measure of when a war is over. But nevertheless, the idea is that we need to denormalize a world in which national security in the United States, and of course we can critique the notion of national security itself, but denormalize the idea that it should be based on and rooted in the dehumanization of Muslims and Muslims as a means to the United States' national security ends. In addition, it's about recalibrating. What is this war really about? It's often, the war on terror has often been referred to, various elements of it, as an endless war, as if the United States has no control over the war's end, as if there is nothing it can do to stop and curb the violence that it has enacted under the guise of the war on terror and the continuous construction of this nebulous terrorist threat. An additional goal of my book is something that really comes out of my work over the last 15 years in this space of the war on terror, and specifically the observation that when we talk about the war on terror, it's rarely ever the case that the targeting of Muslims is central to the analysis. That we understand that in order to dissect, dismantle, and abolish the war on terror, it's necessary to include in that analysis the role of Islamophobia in perpetuating this apparatus of state violence. So this book is about mainstreaming an Islamophobia analysis. It's about pushing back on the idea that the targeting of Muslims was coincidental, accidental, or an unintended consequence of the war on terror. The war on terror was designed to specifically target Muslims. And throughout the book, I underscore and underline the myriad of ways in which that has happened. You know, I've worked in the space of, as I mentioned, closing Guantanamo and ending torture. And in the earlier years, my sort of earlier days of advocacy on Guantanamo, it was rarely the case that people, even in the left and liberal circles, would acknowledge that all of those detained at this infamous prison were Muslim. And to me, that was so startling time and time again, because for one, it's obvious, right? And for two, Islamophobia explains why the prison exists in the first place, how the individuals who've been detained at Guantanamo were subjected to the treatment, the torture that they were subjected to, and how it continues to operate and victimize prisoners post-release. So it's not just about the understanding the targeting of Muslims. Now we've gotten to a place where people may acknowledge that all of those detained have been Muslim at Guantanamo, but that's pretty much where the analysis stops. So it's about understanding what it means and how Islamophobia, again, is rooted in the war on terror and has been weaponized to target Muslims. When I think about the story of the war on terror, there are many different elements, and it's impossible, of course, to understand its totality or to write a book that isn't 10 billion pages that would fully explain what this war on terror has actually been about. But what I try to do in the book is to approach this project of the war on terror through the lens of narrative, through the lens of law and policy, and through the lens of Muslim experiences post 9/11. Narrative is something I focus heavily on, because when you look at the ways in which the meaning of the 9/11 attacks were attached, how it was framed in the early days, who were the protagonists, who were the antagonists, why had the perpetrators committed this, act of violence as they had. There are numerous ways that this was intentionally framed, of course, to bring about the conclusion that the only intervention possible was state violence. For example, Bush would frequently talk about this idea of freedom. The terrorists are against our freedom. He said at one point, quote, "Freedom is at risk, and America and our allies must not and will not allow it," end quote. He also said, given the means, our enemies will be a threat to every nation and eventually to civilization itself. So if you're attaching this meaning to the 9/11 attacks, it's basically expanding the arsenal of tactics in which the US has at its disposal to fight this terrorist threat. And then one final quote I want to raise here is one where Bush talks about justice. So he said, quote, in the same speech on September 20th, 2001, "Whether we bring our enemies to justice or bring justice to our enemies, justice will be done." Of course, we know in the course of the war on terror that justice is not meant for Muslims. But in addition, what this quote really signifies is that whatever the United States is by default justice, because that is what Bush has outlined. When I think about this idea of the war on terror and what it would take, again, to dismantle and abolish it, Part of it, as I've talked extensively about at this point, is the role of Islamophobia. And I'm concerned with a particular form of Islamophobia, which is institutionalized Islamophobia. And institutionalized Islamophobia is what I've been describing this whole presentation, which is Islamophobia that is embedded into the laws and policies of the state and is specifically constructed by the state to sanction hate and fear of Muslims for the pursuit of war and repression. I talk a lot about this idea of social constructions and the idea that there are different social constructions that are embedded into the design and implementation of policies. This is very much the case when it comes to the war on terror, particularly policies that operate with the premise that Islam is violent, barbaric, uncivilized, and the construction, of course, of Muslims as inherently terroristic. Of course, we know the consequences of Islamophobia in the form of state violence. But what Islamophobia does specifically, and the way it operates, is to position Muslims as extending outside of moral boundaries that are extended to other communities. And when you have these moral boundaries where Muslims don't fit into, then it becomes easier for Muslims, for people to accept injustice towards Muslim communities. Now, the other form of Islamophobia that I'm concerned with in this book is internalized Islamophobia. And the reason I focus on internalized Islamophobia is not that it's a unique phenomenon that a group that's marginalized would experience internalized oppression, but specifically because of the way internalized oppression operates generally, and in this context, specifically. So when I talk about internalized Islamophobia, it's the idea, right, that Muslims are constantly bombarded and exist within a context in which they are constantly and repeatedly demonized and criminalized. For any community that is consistently subjected to these ideas about their faith and who they are, it is often difficult to separate oneself from those ideas. Of course, where it becomes a problem is where Muslims themselves internalize these ideas and align themselves with the state, so they become agents of injustice and help to perpetuate the state violence that's being enacted on Muslim communities. So I look at both individually and as they relate to each other. What I wanted to do also in this book is to really understand what is the war on terror. If you've ever looked up a basic question of what is the war on terror, you'll probably find that it's narrowly constructed as mostly relating to militarism and warfare abroad, and specifically the existence of troops on the ground. But I wanted to understand and think about and conceptualize whether there were any sort of boundaries that could help understand what this apparatus has become and grown to. And from that point, how do we actually understand, again, what it would take to dismantle the war on terror? In addition, throughout the course of the last 2 decades, there has been an intentional effort from the government to separate what happens domestically from what happens internationally. Of course, they are very much connected. And another reasoning behind that, not just to sort of evade the idea that they are very deeply connected, but to also diminish the possibility of transnational solidarity. So I develop and conceptualize in this book a taxonomy of the war on terror, of which there are 5 dimensions. This includes militarism and warfare, draconian immigration policies, surveillance, federal terrorism prosecutions, and detention and torture. And this taxonomy, to me, of course, we could probably talk about many other dimensions that are part of the war on terror. But to me, this sort of covers the gamut of the different types of control and the ways in which, and the places where, and ways in which the United States has waged state violence. When we talk about abolishing the war on terror, if we don't know what the war on terror is composed of, if we don't know how surveillance relates to militarism and warfare abroad, if we don't know how detention at a communication management unit is related to detention at Guantanamo Bay, how then do we understand what it is that we're up against? And again, what we need to do to dismantle this war. So alongside this taxonomy are 5 modes of violence. The 5 modes of violence that I conceptualized include corporeal, bordered, panoptic, juridical, and carceral. When it comes to corporeal is the way the state exercises its control of the means of violence directly through the infliction of both psychological and physical harm, as well as death. Bordered violence via draconian immigration policies. So of course, there's a correlation, right, between the dimensions of the war on terror and the forms of violence, is also direct exercise of state power in terms of sovereignty. But here, control of physical borders is leveraged against targeted groups through coercion, such as by restricting immigration or conditioning status on cooperation with state objectives. Panoptic violence is the state uses this power to surveil, obviously we know this, to control groups. Juridical violence, we've seen this very often and very frequently in the course of the war on terror, whether it's being denied access to the legal system altogether, or whether access to the legal system is met with differential justice. And finally, carceral violence, whether it's detention at Guantanamo, whether it's detention at communication management units, detention in the CIA black sites that were used in the earlier days of the war on terror. But obviously, it's the state's physical control over the bodies of its victims. And of course, it bears noting that these modes of violence overlap. So I don't want to talk for too much longer because I know we only have a short amount of time. But in my presentation, when I did my book launch, I thought about the ways that the United States, of course, and this is in my book, talks about the violence of others while evading, of course, and never taking responsibility for its own violence. When I thought about that, the image that came to my mind, perhaps many of you have seen this, is a wall with graffiti in Yemen, in which there is a picture of a US drone, a drawing of a painting of a US drone, with writing underneath that says, "Why did you kill my family?" If we juxtapose that to quotes, for example, Bush said on 9/11, the day of 9/11, he said, today, quote, "Today our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature," end quote. 9 years later, President Obama said, "We can't erase every trace of evil from the world, and small groups of killers have the capacity to do great harm. That was the case before 9/11, and that remains true today. And that's why we must remain vigilant as threats emerge, end quote. So the story of the War on Terror, in light of this graffiti painting and these two quotes, is that whoever has the power to define the story and the narrative are the ones that have the power to inflict massive state violence without consequence or accountability. And despite this juxtaposition, right, the United States continues to use words. The narrative often defaults to the use of words such as evil, which signifies an inherent characteristic, right? Which means that terrorists, the construction of terrorism, of course, we can go into that separately, but the idea that evil is inherent. And you can't rehabilitate something that's inherent. The only thing you can do, the only way you can intervene in someone's inherent nature of evil is brute force. So not only is the United States legitimizing its use of violence, it's also delegitimizing the possibility that the people who've been targeted are human. We're now at the 20+ year mark of the War on Terror, right? And so there are important questions to think about, right? We could say we're at an impasse. Maybe we are, maybe we're not. Depends on how you answer the question of, has the war succeeded or failed? But needless to say, at this point, I was 18 when the 9/11 attacks happened. I've taught a couple of courses since at George Mason University, for example. And many of the students in those classes don't have this recollection of what the 9/11 attacks mean. What they have is a history book that says that this happened and the normalization of all the measures that have been put into place ever since. And so to conclude, I think it's important, of course, to think about how to dismantle and abolish the War on Terror. But also in that, really thinking about the construction and the narratives and the idea specifically when the United States says the war is over. Last year it said that when troops were withdrawn from Afghanistan. Troops were also withdrawn from Iraq last year. And the government said the war is over. What does it mean for a war to be over? A war ending is not, again, just about the absence of troops on the ground, which of course there are still troops on the ground, so that doesn't even work with their logic or assertions. But it is about the ability for people who are being targeted by the government to not live in constant fear. I remember viscerally a quote, I think it was a drone survivor who was 13 years old, who basically said he no longer likes blue skies because when the skies are clear, it means that there's a greater likelihood that there'll be a drone strike. If after and if ever drone strikes actually stop, I believe the young boy was Pakistani, the presence of war means that he still thinks about that when he sees the color of the sky. So war is not over until it's over. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Meha, for that presentation. Before I open it up to questions, I thought I would just insert myself in the queue and ask one myself. I'm really intrigued by the movement conversations around the idea of abolishing the War on Terror and kind of engaging with abolitionist discourse. One of the things that, that we see in the conversations around abolishing prisons and abolishing policing is like trying to find a way to connect the dots between the horizon of abolition and concrete things that folks can do kind of today, right? And that's where this, whole non-reformist reform kind of concept jumps in. So I'm thinking, for example, of like, from my own experience, like abolitionist bail funds, for example, in the prison context. So in the war on terror context, is there like what kinds of non-reformist reforms do you think are worth pursuing, if any? And how do we translate the idea of abolishing the war on terror into like an actual praxis of liberation? Because to be really honest, the suspicion and the concern that I encounter sometimes around this language is that it's a little bit like bandwagoning, right? Like abolition is the fashionable thing now, so let's just kind of attach ourselves to it. So yeah, I'd be really curious and would love to learn from you kind of about, how you think about that dilemma.
Yeah, that's a great question, Daryl, and I really appreciate you asking. Let me say one thing that you didn't ask in particular, but because I had written about this, actually, this idea of abolishing Guantanamo. And what I talked about in the piece that I wrote about it in was, there's this idea of terrorism, of course, being this inherent characteristic, right? You're an inherently terroristic individual, right? Muslims are terroristic. And the ways in which irredeemability is ascribed to Muslims. And in many ways, I feel that the war on terror and its, abolition has been very separate from the abolition work that's going on, I'd say somewhat domestically, right? Or pretty heavily domestically. So to me, there's kind of been this separation, which in my mind means the war on terror has succeeded in that sense, right? To separate out this idea and these constructions of terrorism because people don't want to deal with it. Because that's how the government has made it so, right? That we can't touch this idea of terrorism. And so from the get-go, I think the first step here, right, is to kind of put these two spaces in sync, right? We're fundamentally talking about abolishing state violence towards marginalized communities. And one of the things I find hard in discussions in the realm of abolition is, if you are someone in Guantanamo Bay or someone in a communication management unit domestically, are we going to tell that person to wait for non-reformist ways for them to get out of prison? Or are we going to advocate for the closure of the prison? Are we going to advocate for more humane conditions? What are we going to do in the interim? And I think to me, one of the problems, and I myself am not an expert on this, but I think one of the issues when we talk about abolition, right, is even when we're employing non-reformist tactics, there's not always a clear vision as to how that will get us closer to the path of abolition. So I think that to me is one of the problems. And, it's very interesting how do we actually incorporate this into, an actual practice? And I think there's a lot of ways, right? The way that we default to punishment, right? This country is all about punishment. How do we understand punishment, right? And how do we understand, there are a lot of ways that from obviously the war on terror, the narratives that have been constructed about Islam, Muslims, and just general national security, that there are no interventions possible beyond those that are based on brute force. And so how do we begin to think about spaces and places where we can think about harm and injury to others? And this is very complicated, right? I mean, if you've been a target of state violence or if you've been a target of interpersonal violence, these questions become a lot more personal. So, I just think like they're very, abolition is a very complex conversation. And I know, people have varying levels of difficulty communicating its abstractness versus its practicality. And I think I kind of fall somewhere in the middle, but to me, it's just about, I think fundamentally really getting people out of the mindset that punishment is the only possibility. And that obviously feeds into whether or not you use reformist or non-reformist tactics. And then also in this broader context, how do we sync the war on terror and our understanding of the war on terror with abolition domestically, or more so how it's used in a domestic context, in order to really abolish what is at the root, which is state violence, which is fundamentally the same, just manifested in different ways. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. When you say non-reformist tactics, do you mean like like reforming or rehabilitating, quote unquote, like the people who are in captivity? Or do you
No,
mean non-reformist reforms, and that in like the, you know, Ruth Wilson Gilmore sense of?
the latter.
Okay, yeah, just checking. Okay, because
Yeah, the latter.
you brought up redeemability a few times and punishment, and you know, like what's interesting about that is, like, from my understanding, and I'm sure you know more about this than me, like the the sort of reigning ideology of U.S. prison policy was rehabilitation for several decades in the middle of 20s. So, you know, so you're not advocating for like a return to like rehabilitation versus punishment, because that's not necessarily abolitionist. Okay, I just want to wanted to clarify that. Okay.
Well, actually, can I say
yeah, please.
something?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
For those of you who haven't heard, there was a horrible movie that premiered at the Sundance Film Festival called Jihad Rehab, actually. Perhaps some of you have heard of it. And it was about 4 former Guantanamo prisoners who were sent to a rehabilitation center in Saudi Arabia. And it's for, you know, quote, terrorists. And the idea is, of course, that you can rehabilitate someone out of being a terrorist, which is a very problematic construction, but also just the idea that you're rehabilitating someone out of this idea of jihad. And so I mentioned this just because rehabilitation, the concept is obviously very problematic. And what is actually at the core, and what are the assumptions of rehabilitation, right? How do you rehabilitate someone out of terrorism? And how do you actually think about rehabilitation outside of this context of state violence and the, you know, conditions of violence that these people have existed in? And that's across the board when we're talking about domestic incarceration as well. Rehabilitation is a very flawed premise, especially when it's executed by the very state that committed the violence in the first place.
Yeah, my client in Guantanamo was Saudi, so he, when he was transferred out of the prison, he spent several years in the so-called rehabilitation center, which is, for those who may not be aware, it's essentially detention without charge. You know, the conditions in that particular center are, you know, they are a step up from Guantanamo, to be sure, but the entire framing of it, you know, as you said, Maha, is deeply problematic. And in many ways, this is based on a program that was started in Yemen, I think in 2004, 2005, by a judge called Hamoud al-Hattar. I actually interviewed him back in the day. And it was actually really a scam. Like, he was using it to like impress essentially like Western donors to put money into the state. Anyway, so there's this way in which like the, you know, don't be punitive, be rehabilitative line ends up kind of being folded into the sort of, you know, broader war on terror apparatus in ways that are, that are obviously disturbing. And yeah, I encourage folks to check out the debate around this film. I haven't yet had the opportunity to see it myself, but there's a lot of questions about the ethics of representation. This is a, you know, this sort of white American filmmaker who got unprecedented access to this Saudi facility, and a lot of questions around how that happened. And yeah, the way that she approaches the people in the film and talks about them, there's a lot to get into there. We've reached the end of the hour, so I know that folks have to run. But thank you, Meha, for sharing your work with us. And everyone, please just join me in thanking and welcoming Dr. Meha Hilal once again.